So again, today, Monday, October 18th, we're going to go over chapters 8, which again is an introduction to jQuery, and 9, which talks about effects and animations. Tomorrow, the 19th, we will go over chapter 10, which talks about working jQuery with forms, and chapter 11, which is on plugins and widgets. All right? So that's where we stand. So by the end of this week, we are through the first 2 sections of the book. So next Monday, we're going to start up on chapter 12. All right? Okay. Now, even before we go into this, all right, so even before we start on this, all right, what's in here? An intro to jQuery, the basics of jQuery, the email list application, more skills with jQuery, and 3 illustrative applications. Fine and dandy. But if you go out here, you don't have to do this, but if you go out to jquery.com, that's the jQuery website. I think I've even shown you some of this before, but just to reiterate about 3 things. Number 1, notice when it says here, download jQuery. Everybody see the big button right here? If I click here, I can go and I can download the compressed version, which looks really ugly because all unnecessary white space has been removed. All right, so we can do that. Or we can be pretty and download the uncompressed version. And you'll see that when you do that, it is now, I guess it brought it up in the wrong editor, but several thousand lines long. Is that fair enough to say? All right, if you want to do that, that's totally fine as well. Now, you don't even have to do that. What you can do is you can reference jQuery using what's called a CDN, or Content Delivery Network. All right? And I do want to show you this because I know I didn't earlier. But if I go out, I think it's cdn.com, but I could be wrong. That's not what I want. Okay. That might be it. I don't know. One of these things, I don't know where it is, but one of these things has got a listing of all the CDNs, all the Content Delivery Network URLs that you might ever want. Bootstrap, Bootstrap CSS, Bootstrap JavaScript, Font Awesome, Google Fonts, and jQuery. All right? Now, so you don't, let's say, I don't know that even exists. Well, if I come over here and I'm going to do a Control F and I'm going to type in here CDN. All right? So here it is with CDNs. All right? And notice there's a Google, there's a Microsoft, etc. So I'll just go out to the Microsoft one. And if I do that, notice what it has here. So you can download either the minified one or the regular one. So you would literally put this in your code. Does that make sense to everybody? All right. Now, the advantage of doing that is many times if you go out and reference something out on the web or whatever, it's expecting you already have jQuery loaded. All right, so it'll probably make your program work a little faster. That's the good news. The bad news is if you link to it on the internet and you don't have an internet connection, you're kind of hosed. So what a lot of people do is they copy it in, like I just showed you, either the minified or the non-minified, and they also link to it using a CDN. Then they check in their code and they say if you've got an internet connection, use the CDN one. Otherwise, use the other one. So you'll find it done a lot of different ways, is what I'm telling you. All right, so we're going to talk about what jQuery is. It is JavaScript. It's a JavaScript library. Just like, you go to your own library, what do you go there for? To borrow things. That's kind of what this is for as well. It's got a bunch of pre-written routines that you're able to use. All right? So again, if I do go back out there again, the other thing that I wanted to show you on here, and again, I probably mentioned it the other day, but just in case I didn't. So there's what jQuery is. You can read that on your own. That's not a big thing. But if you go down to the API documentation, and you start working your way through here, and you look here, this is alphabetized. I don't know how many of these there are. My guess is well over 100. That's the API. Those are all the different methods that you can use from here. So for instance, if I wanted to use this add method and I clicked on this, all right, sooner or later in here, it'll show me examples of exactly how I can plug it in. Again, this used to be the ultimate way of doing things. And the main reason for that is you couldn't do a lot of this stuff using, quote, vanilla JavaScript, unquote, which means just JavaScript. Much of this stuff today you can, so jQuery isn't being used as much as it used to be used. That said, it's out there in literally millions of websites, which to me is reason enough to go through it, even if we're not spending a lot of time on it, to at least give you an initial exposure to it. All right. So it says it's a free open source JavaScript library that provides dozens of methods for common web features that make JavaScript programming easier. Okay. This is a key thing. These particular routines have been coded and tested for cross-browser compatibility. They should work the same regardless of whether you're using IE, Firefox, Chrome, whatever. All right, and if you went out and looked at the can I use, virtually what you'll find is other than maybe some really old versions of IE, all of this stuff should be supported. Says similarly, it provides selectors that are CSS3 compliant. The good news about that, CSS3 is the newest version of CSS. And even though it's several years old now, a lot of browsers still don't support all of its functionality. All right, and usually in the past, before jQuery, if you wanted to do something that wasn't exactly supported, you'd have to kind of shoehorn your way in. And what I mean is you'd put maybe a hack or something in there to make it work. You don't have to do stuff like that anymore. Now, as it says, although the use of jQuery has been declining in several years, as of February 2020, a W3 Tech survey found that 74% of the top 10 million websites still use jQuery. Now, what's the big takeaway from that? That used to be well over 90%. So you can see it's already gone down by about 15 to 20%. All right, and the thought process is it will continue to go down as far as new development goes in the future. But a lot of these sites are working just fine. jQuery will be up and running long after I retire, both as a teacher and as a human being. All right, it'll still be out there. So it says, for some tasks, jQuery is more concise and easier than pure JavaScript. It may be easier to use. All right, so it's something that if you plan on getting a career as a web developer, you'll have to become accustomed to. All right? And as it says, don't forget it is JavaScript. It says, in other words, when you use jQuery, you call JavaScript methods stored in the jQuery library. All right? So again, I showed you the site. Nothing much more to say about it than that. Now, how can it simplify JavaScript web development? Well, one thing that everybody is going for all the time is how to make things easier. And you got to look at it this way. Typically, when you make things easier, what you're doing is you're giving more power to the software, which means you're taking less power away from you. That said, and I've mentioned this to you before, it doesn't matter. Because even if the software has 100% of the power and all you're doing is calling stuff, if you call it wrong, it's your butt on the line. All right? So you'll notice the use strict. This doesn't look new. Content loaded. We've talked about this stuff already. So let's talk about what's different. Look at this line right here. This is literally a variable called h2s. In other words, it's all of the h2 tags. Document dot, now here we're using a query selector all because we want every h2 tag. And the way that you typically refer to things when you're using jQuery is like this. The pound sign, whatever the name is of the ID, and then what tag it is you're looking for. And as you'd probably guess, if for some reason FAQS was not an ID, if it was a class, that would be .FAQS. All right? And then notice what you can do here. Since it is JavaScript, now they're looping through here. Why are they looping through here? Because they're trying to figure out, this is that FAQ page, so they're trying to figure out which one you might have just clicked. All right, so if it's got a plus on it, you click it, it's going to change to a minus. If you got a minus on it, you click it, it's going to change to a plus. And you'll also notice they've got h20.firstchild.focus. What does that mean? It means the active one is the first one. So you can see with h2s, it's basically returning an array. And if you say I'm still a little fuzzy on arrays, that's what the next section of the book is going to be about that we start on next week. All right? So it says here, and when you look at this, I don't know how many lines there are here. 15 maybe? 10? And here's the equivalent of doing it in just, that's doing it in JavaScript. This is doing it more in jQuery. So notice what goes away. That pretty much goes away right there. All right? And that pretty much kind of goes away because what you put in here, this $sign with the document.ready is basically saying once the DOM has been loaded. That's the easiest way to look at it. And notice you typically put everything you want to do, everything that you want to do, you put inside of here. And you may have noticed this already, you may not have, but if you look up on the screen here, this right here, that left paren, that's the ending paren. That left curly, that's the ending curly. All right? And that's typically how it's done. And even, when you take the class in next fall, all right, the AWD 1111 class, and we write stuff, it's not going to look that different than this. It's not jQuery that we're writing, but it looks very similar rather. So it's doing the same thing. So what's different? Well, notice const h2 equals evt.currentTarget. That means the one that you just clicked. All right? And then h2.toggleClass. That's kind of nice. Toggle class means click it. If it's on, it's now off. If it's off, it's now on. And one of the things that jQuery has is it's got toggle everything. All right? And then you go, it says to the next one, dot toggle class open, and just like we've been doing, the prevent default. All right, set focus to the first one. Again, we're using a different method. If you want to know what this stuff means, I already showed you the link to the jQuery documentation. And you could find out more about find, you could find out more about toggle class, etc., plus a lot of different examples of using them. All right? So you might think, well, this one that we did before makes more sense. I'm not going to deny that. All right? Well, typically in the past, what people have told me is, well, what I don't like about jQuery is it's really hard to understand. Yeah, but wasn't the JavaScript hard to understand when you first started learning it? All right, it's just another way to use JavaScript. All right, and they talk in here next, we've already heard this, the minified version, etc. You can see jQuery itself is about now 15 years old, right? 2006, so it's really not that old, but I would say this, it's mature. In other words, something that came out in 2019 is not as mature as something that came out in 2006. But again, the idea is to always try to make it better. So they talk in here about using the CDN. It says jQuery recommends that you use the sub-resource integrity SRI checking. That's this stuff here. All right? And the reason for that is what it does behind the scenes is it tries to check and make sure no one's gotten into those files and corrupted them, done something they weren't supposed to do. All right, so they explain the difference between the compressed and the uncompressed versions. Now also notice that, again, that 5 years ago, 3.0 came out, right? And one of the things that they had in 3.0 was called this slim version. What they did was they went through and they said, okay, we've kind of looked at a lot of sites, etc., and we found out that the majority of them don't use this, don't use this, don't use this, etc. So the slimmed down version has got the stuff that most people and most developers use, and it got rid of the old stuff. Why should you care? All right? You should care because it'll load faster. So again, if you're working on a site where that's important, all right, notice what it says it doesn't include. The Ajax. The Ajax is what allows for those partial page refreshes, and it also doesn't include the effects modules. All right, so if you want to do things like animation, all right, the majority of websites don't have animation in them. Especially, I mean, if I'm going and I'm doing something that's going to be a textual site, all right, that literally, or if it's a very simple site that I'm creating, I'm probably going to want the slim version. All right. So it says here how to code jQuery selectors. It says the $, when used this way, is an alias for the use of jQuery. So you can use this, or you can use this. I don't know about you, but I'm going to use the $ every time. All right? But using it in jQuery basically says you don't have that in there anymore as an alias to use for query selector or query selector all or get element by ID. So they give you some examples here, and that's typically how you use it. So notice, how to select elements by an ID, by a class, etc. This says select all paragraphs. All right. This says select the element with an ID of FAQS. This says select every element with a class of minus, etc. All right. And there are descendants you can use. I will tell you that when the time we were using this hot and heavy, I would discourage people because I could never remember which one was the plus and which one was the tilde, and which one was the greater than, etc. And anything you do using those, you can do without them. But it's more work. All right? So as it says, when you use jQuery, you can use the $ to refer to the jQuery library. Then you code the selectors within quotation marks, single or double quotes. Doesn't matter. All right. Calling the methods. Well, some of this looks very similar to what you've seen before. Some looks a little bit different. We're used to using .value. Now it's .val. All right? As it says, if you want to get the text of an element, .text. All right? If you're iterating your way through, you might use a next. Submit is still submit, just like we did in the example that I showed you. Focus is still focus. And there's a lot of other ones that are in here. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list, as you'd probably guess. All right? So they show you some examples here. So here's like a simple miles per gallon in the first two examples. Const gallons equals $, double quote, pound gallons, double quote, .val. Same kind of thing we did before. So if you had a text box that was called gallons with an ID of gallons, that's how you would grab its value and assign it to a local variable or to a constant variable named gallons. That makes sense? Then we've got it the other way. So the first one that's there is a getter. You're grabbing it and assigning it to something. The second one is a setter. Then they show similar ones using email. Then they show another one, how to submit a form. That's assuming that you've got a form with an ID of join list. All right, and here's how you can move the focus. So as it says there, to call the method, you code the selector, the dot operator, the method name, and any associated parameters. The other thing you can do, and you're going to see some examples as we go on, is you can use what it's called chaining. So if I want to do 3 different things to something, I can say the name of the element dot do this, then dot do this, then dot do this. And it always goes from left to right. So whatever you do put first after the first dot, it does first. dot, then it does what's next, dot, then it does what's next. All right? And there's even a way that typically people code this. I think they're going to show an example in here, but I'll hold off until they do. All right. So there's the syntax as it says for a jQuery event method. So again, notice there's the document.ready. The DOM is ready. That's replacing that the DOM content loaded, basically. The way that jQuery works is the stuff that's inside of your document.ready should not run until the DOM has been loaded. All right? And also notice, as it says, there's a long way of doing this, and there's a short way of doing this. So if you're ever using it, you'll see both ways. This is just the default for this. That's all. All right? Then they're showing here how you can attach an event handler. It isn't that different from the stuff we looked at before. It's just syntactically it's different. But the same thing is happening as the stuff that we looked at earlier. So again, you can read this yourselves, but it's basically, that's what it said to you. Now notice it says when coding one event handler within another, closing braces, parentheses, semicolons, etc., is critical. All right, it's very easy to screw it up when you're using this stuff. I'm just telling you right now, it is. Which is another reason I think that it's probably waning a little bit in its popularity. So they go through this email list application here. You've seen this one before. We looked at this. So what do we care about? Well, the first one has to be a properly formatted email. That's all we care about. All right, something at something dot something. All right, then for the confirm, all we're checking with is, does it equal exactly what was put in the first one? All right, and then the first name, it's required. So it's very similar to stuff that we've looked at before. All right, so what's new in here? Well, they put spans in. These, at the beginning, these are all going to be, if I think everything is mandatory in there, there'll be the red asterisk here, here, and here. All right, plus they're adding jQuery. You always want to add jQuery before your own JavaScript files, not after. All right, otherwise you might end up overwriting something that you put in. So when we look here, again, looks a little different, yeah, but basically it's the same kind of thing that we looked at before. Here's an example right here. If you look on the screen, there's an example of chaining. Dot next, dot text. Now, it's even legal, just so you know, because a lot of times you'll see it like this, the way that this one is written right here. A lot of times you'll see it like this, $, email, _1, I think that is. Then you'll see on the next line, dot next, dot text, and then whatever they put in there. That's totally legit to do that, and many, many developers, when they're chaining, write it like that. Especially, I mean, you could chain sometimes 5, 6, 10 things in there. And you don't want to write a line that's going to be 500 characters long. So again, that's pretty much the same one that we had written earlier. So, all right. Says the next 3 figures present more skills for working with the most useful jQuery selectors, methods, and event handlers. Okay, then let's look at them. Again, all they did here was they went basically into the API documentation that I've already shown you and said the stuff that's in there, this is probably the stuff you're going to use most often. And then they give you examples on each one. Notice it says this doesn't include some selectors, all right? In Chapter 9, it says you'll learn about a selector that's used with animation. In Chapter 10, you'll learn about selectors used for form controls, all right? You know, I always kind of cringe when you see something like this in a book. The most useful methods. You know, that's like when you read an article and somebody says the best whatever. Yeah, in their opinion. All right. So as it says, here's a lot of those methods, and when you look in here, you'll realize that virtually all of the methods that they've shown in here have required parameters. All right, when you're doing something. So this said the most useful methods, and then we've got the most useful event methods. All right, and many of these we've already looked at. You know that much of the work that you're going to do, whether it's using jQuery or not using jQuery, is going to involve you clicking a button to make something happen. All right, so there's your click event. If you're doing work where you're writing a game or something like that, then the mouse stuff is going to become very important. If you're working with special effects, the hover might become very important. All right? And this, because they talked about it earlier, but now they're not talking about it until now, current target. Get the HTML element that triggered the event. That's the current target. So again, if it was click a button to make something happen, the button would be that current event. You already know what prevent default is. And as it says here, the figure does not present all event methods. So they did mouse events, they didn't do keyboard events. All right, as an example. And some other methods they say you should at least be aware of. Some of this stuff is really quirky, the way that, you know, when you take a look at it. Notice on events, off events, one events, and trigger events. As it says, on events, attach an event handler to one or more events. Turn it on. Off is just the opposite. All right, and one is kind of like when we used the timer, and it was a one-time shot. Well, in here, notice, attach an event handler, but after it runs, then remove it. All right? And trigger to make something happen. It says when you use a shortcut method to attach an event handler, you're actually using the on method. So if you looked at some of the examples earlier, as you might expect, almost always this stuff can be written in a multiple number of ways. All right? I'm of the mindset, hopefully you agree with this, and even if you don't, that's fine, that I don't care if it's jQuery, I don't care if it's straight JavaScript, I don't care what you're using, you should always write it in the most straightforward way possible. All right, sometimes that involves writing more code, so sometimes there's ways of writing it where you can compress different things, but if it makes it harder to understand, are you really making it better? Well, if you're working on a website that is real-time sensitive, you might have to do it that way. But if you're working on a mom-and-pop website, is it really going to matter to them if it takes somebody 2 seconds for something to come up as opposed to 1.3 seconds? All right, that kind of an idea. So they go back and they rewrite this FAQ thing that you've seen now probably 3 or 4 times. And you'll notice, well, look, some of the HTML, so not much has really changed. Some of the CSS, that's not really changed. But what you'd guess is the JavaScript and jQuery changed. So if you say, yeah, I'd really kind of like to learn this stuff, then what I'd suggest is go back in your book and find out where they wrote this using straight JavaScript and have this one. Again, you've got all the code from the book, all right? And, you know, I got asked in the other class, maybe I told you this, Gabriel, one of my students in the other class asked, he said, how come most of the time you use Visual Studio Code, but sometimes you don't, you just, you know, you use Notepad++. Well, Notepad++, and I know you can do it in code too, but I can come in here, and if I wanted to take this file right here, let's say, all right, and I wanted to put that, I could come in here, right mouse click on it, and choose Move to Other View. I do that a lot when I'm trying to learn something, and I'll have maybe one way of doing it here and one way of doing it there. And I'll go back and forth between the two and take a look at them. That makes it easier for me. And I'm just saying, that's me. I'm not saying that's you, because everybody learns this stuff differently. All right, so at the bottom there it says, when you attach an event handler to a hyperlink, you often need to cancel the default action. Well, that should make sense. We've been doing that. All right, to do that, as it says, you can call the prevent default. Nothing new there. All right, then they do an image swap. Now this one then is new. All right. So the idea is if you click on any of these thumbnails, so if they must have just clicked on that one right there, and you notice the picture here changes. I've shown you this, and we're going to do something similar to this tomorrow or Wednesday in that gym website where I had the before and after pictures of people, and I had like 4 of them up here and thumbnails, and if you click on one, the before and after comes in down here. Well, the key thing is if you take a look at the code, what's kind of nice about it is its brevity. This is everything. All right? So this, as it says, and they've commented it, preloads the images. Again, so it hopefully at least will run faster. All right? Then attach event handlers for the links. Why? Because if these things are literally set up in here as hyperlinks, you don't want them to go anywhere. All right? So you want to prevent the default that we've talked about. All right? Then attaching event handlers. So when you click on them, what do you want to have happen? Notice, becomes the current event. Then swap the image out. And that's all that this is doing. And it'd be kind of nice if you've got captions for each one. If you're going to swap out the images, you might as well swap out the captions. What you're going to find is I didn't even put captions in the one that I did. All right? And then move the focus to the first one. All right. We've already talked about the benefits of preloading images before. They mention them again here on the bottom of page 273. All right, then they've got a rollover. And again, you probably have seen rollovers before. And I've even used this example. I don't know if it's still out there or not, but it used to be like for slimfast.com, they had before and after pictures of people. It looks like they don't anymore. All right, and there's other places, Nutrisystem and places like that too. All right, but my guess is you have all seen that before, where you go onto a site, you put your mouse on it, there's like before and after pictures or whatever. All right. So as it says, move your mouse over an image and change it back out, to the image to restore the original one. If you are going to use this, I guess that's it. But if you are going to use this, you want to make it as simple for someone to use as possible. Don't think that you're doing a wrong thing by giving instructions up on the top or on the bottom or wherever, because somebody's not going to know how to do it. That's just human nature. That's what's going to happen. All right. So that's it. Any questions on anything in there? Again, I'm not giving you any homework or any tests, no written tests on this. So in just a second, we'll take our first break, and when we get done, we're going to go over Chapter 9, which again, not a super long chapter, and it goes through how to use effects and animation. The only thing I'll mention quickly on there is it says, as you read this chapter, you might find it too difficult to understand some of these methods until you see them in action. That's how you learn it anyway. And I've already mentioned this to you, but as I'm going through this, and I don't even care if you sit and play while I'm going through this, but if you go out to jQueryUI.com, very ugly website, but if you go out to effects, and I'm just going to go out, for example, to easing right here, all right? And you can see these, and I can click on them, you can see exactly what's happening, all right? So this is a nice site. It doesn't have everything that's in here, but it's got a bunch of the stuff that's in here. And most of the stuff that they put in here for the examples in the chapter are real simplistic, all right? I mean, I can't imagine wanting to have a site where I've got a red background and I put a green square on it and I have it constantly go in a square or in a circle or whatever. You could do that, and maybe there would be a very valid reason for doing that. But again, many of the examples they're going to show in here are really simple. So notice here they've got, even on the side here, they got examples. All right, so if I go down, for example, I think, where is it? All right, this was the one. So the different effects. So notice there's blind. Does that make sense? It's supposed to be like a blind, like a shade or whatever you'd call it. They've got explode, you can see all those. And what's nice about each one of these is if you go to the view source, it shows you that. And all of the jQuery is in a script tag, all right? But they give you all the code. If you literally go in and just copy this, it should work. Now, except for one thing, and that is look up on the screen here. Do you notice where it says here, I don't know why they've got it like that, but it says // Most of the time you have to put an HTTP or HTTPS before you do that. Other than that, they should just work the way they are, which, like I said, for free, it's kind of nice if you're trying to teach this stuff to yourselves. All right, so let's take a break. It is 9:08. Tell you what, let's come back at 9:20 and we'll see if we can finish this by no later than 10. All right.